Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 36, The Peace of Aachen. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, aware that he was old, Charles held an assembly to settle the succession. The empire would be divided among his three sons, Charles the Younger, Pippin, and Louis. Basically, most of the empire would go to Charles because he was the eldest, but Pippin and Louis would receive larger versions of their current kingdoms. Sadly, the Eastern Empire did not have a similar succession plan. In fact, the lack of a clear successor led to a coup against Irene, who was replaced by Nikephoros, a former bureaucrat. Relations between the two empires were poor, but the Bulgars were a greater threat to the Eastern Empire, so Nikephoros led an army against the Bulgars. Unfortunately, he marched into a trap and was killed along with most of the imperial army. While the Franks were expanding east, they also had to deal with Benevento, since Duke Grimwald had promoted himself to prince. While Pippin's efforts to discipline Benevento had not succeeded, Frankish interests in Italy had a victory in 805 when the Doge of Venice traveled to Aachen to swear fealty. While the switch in allegiance may have appeared sudden, a growing number of Venetians had been pushing for a closer relationship with the Franks, who controlled nearby Friuli. Still, the key factor had been a need for protection. The Doge, basically Duke, in theory, governed the lagoon on behalf of the Eastern Empire, but the Doge was elected by a local assembly. Oblerio, the current Doge, had gained his position when he led a coup against the previous Doge a year earlier. However, Oblerio proved unpopular and hoped that a powerful overlord would ensure that he avoided a coup. Venice's change in allegiance was a dangerous sign for the Eastern Empire since it was a key trade center that had been under the protection of Constantinople. However, Constantinople appeared unable to actually provide protection. The Doge had faced reality and recognized that Lombardy was closer than Constantinople. Honestly, this seems fair, but Constantinople was not willing to lose Venice. Fortunately, a sizable element in the city remained loyal to the Eastern Empire and the thriving trade with Constantinople. Naturally, the pro-Constantinople faction was supported by the Eastern Empire, which sent a fleet to Venice. Naturally, Pippin had no choice but to march over and remind the Venetians who was the most powerful empire in the region. However, Pippin discovered that it was not easy to besiege a port. Ships from Constantinople kept the population comfortably fed, while Pippin was stuck outside of the city for a very long, very frustrating, and ultimately futile siege. As disease ravaged his troops during the summer of 810, Pippin finally accepted a Venetian offer to pay an annual tribute to save face and went home, but he died soon after and was succeeded by his son Bernard. The death of his son prompted Charles to negotiate with the Eastern Empire. Would Constantinople be receptive to negotiations? Michael I had become emperor in 811 and recognized that he had little choice but to negotiate a peace with the upstart emperor, since the Bulgars were directly threatening Constantinople. Remember, the empire had just suffered its greatest defeat since Adrianople over 4 centuries earlier, so Michael, unsurprisingly, was willing to accept a peace with the Franks. Signing the Peace of Aachen in 812, Michael agreed to end all hostility between the two empires as well as call Charles brother, thus legitimizing Charles as emperor. While Michael has received credit for signing a treaty with Charles, the treaty was the result of negotiations first initiated by Nikephoros' envoys, who were negotiating with Charles when Nikephoros was killed by the Bulgars. Honestly, the treaty made sense. The Eastern Empire was a Greek empire that had little connection to Rome other than nostalgia. Anyway, it was a fair deal since Charles abandoned all claims to Venice, the cities of Istria, and the Dalmatian coast. In return, the Franks retained control over Croatian Dalmatia. Admittedly, Charles did not actually occupy the Dalmatian coast at that time, but he was willing to stop his expansion in that direction just to be called emperor. Unfortunately, Michael proved unable to either defeat Krum or negotiate a peace with the Bulgars, so he was overthrown by a general named Leo, who became Emperor Leo V in 813. In the end, the war ended when Krum had a stroke and died in 814. Krum was succeeded by his son Ormutag, who negotiated a peace 2 years later in order to focus on internal issues. Aside from all of the territories that had been forcibly added to the empire, Charles's authority was not unchallenged within the empire, since his power rested on the support of semi-autonomous nobles who would rebel or refuse to support his external campaigns if he imposed his authority. Therefore, the title of emperor was valuable, since it signified that he was not merely a Frankish king, but a ruler with international status. Still, Charles met with his leading nobles every May, officially to plan the coming campaign, but also to discuss any important religious or secular issues. So, what were the key issues facing the Frankish Empire? An unexpected result of Frankish expansion into Saxony was conflict with the Danes. Franks had been trading with the Scandinavians for at least a century before Charles took power in 768. To be honest, given the steady expansion of the Frankish kingdom and the establishment of bishoprics in Hamburg and Bremen as advanced bases for Christian mercenaries, the Danish king Godfred may have understandably felt threatened. Aside from their track record of imposing a religious monopoly, the Franks threatened to dominate the trade route between the Baltic Sea and the coast of Western Europe. Denmark had prospered because it controlled trade between Frisia and the eastern Baltic and the trade route north to Norway. Both routes passed through Hedeby, which had become a thriving Danish trading center with toll booths and its own mint, rivaling the main trading centers in Charles's empire. Merchants simply had to portage their goods 8 miles to access the Baltic, avoiding a long, dangerous sail around Jutland. Adopting a precautionary approach, Godfred strengthened the existing fortifications that divided southern Denmark from northern Saxony, while expanding the trading town of Hedeby. Godfred had not started the construction. The defensive wall had been built to protect Denmark from Saxon raids, but he strengthened them. At the same time, seaborne raiders emerged from Scandinavia to plunder Frankish ports, but it is not clear that they operated under Godfred's authority. In fact, his growing power in Denmark may have driven his rivals to go raiding. A recent technological advance, the Vikings' clinker-built ships greatly expanded the speed and reach of raiding parties. In response to the raids, the Franks built watchtowers along the coast and established a fleet in the region. While Godfred had avoided conflict with the Franks, the situation escalated in 808 when he abducted the merchants of the trading center of Rerick, located in Frisia near the border with Denmark. Actually, a possible explanation for Godfred's raid on the town is that nearby land had been given to Wendish allies of Charles who likely threatened Rerick, which he controlled. Recognizing that Rerick was dangerously exposed to the Franks, Godfred simply removed the merchants and their goods and torched the town. The merchants were then transferred to Hedeby. Regardless of whether it was a raid or a daring business move, the situation was a direct challenge to Charles. However, Denmark was located on the edge of a very large, very loosely organized empire, and a campaign against that massive wall was daunting. Even so, Charles was preparing to invade, but Godfred was killed by one of his followers in 810, possibly because he was provoking a dangerous neighbor. He was succeeded by his nephew Hemming, who negotiated a peace a year later. Charles was probably happy to avoid a conflict since he had learned that his son Pippin had died in Italy, and delegations from Cordoba and Constantinople had arrived in Aachen. And a massive epidemic had killed most of the cattle in the empire in 810, so the northern campaign was cancelled. However, Hemming died in 812, and the throne ended up in the hands of two brothers, Harold Klak and Reginfrid, who may have initially been regents for Hemming's son. Little is known of the brothers before they appear as the rulers of Hedeby. Honestly, little is known of Denmark at the time, including how much of Denmark was controlled by the King of Hedeby. In 813, Harold and Reginfred led an army to Norway to force the lords of the region to pay tribute. Returning home, they were defeated in battle by the sons of Godfred, and Reginfred died the following year in an attempt to regain the throne. The Frankish kingdom would have likely invaded Denmark, but Charles was extremely old and lacked the energy for a campaign. The spas were comfortable and he was tired. In fact, Charles seemed to lack the energy to delegate command of a campaign to anyone. Part of the problem is that Charles had fewer people to delegate to. Charles the Younger died in 811. Sadly, little is known about Charles the Younger. As I said, he had not married, even though he was the eldest of Charles's legitimate children. Once Charles became emperor, Charles the Younger commanded the Frankish army during its campaigns, usually against the Slavs as the empire expanded east. Anyway, he died of something near the end of 811. Following the deaths of two sons in a little over a year, Louis was left as the only son, smashing Charles's carefully arranged succession plan. After careful thought, he held an assembly at Aachen in September 813. Charles appointed Louis joint emperor, and he made his grandson Bernard king of Italy, watched carefully by two of Charles's trusted relatives, Count Wala and Abbot Adelhard, since Bernard was only 12. It is worth pointing out that the Pope was not involved in this coronation ceremony, which is especially interesting since Leo, the Pope who had first crowned Charles emperor, was still Pope. Was there a disagreement over whether Charles and Louis would travel to Rome or Leo would travel to Aachen, but their respective schedules just never worked out? Apparently not, since there is no record of Charles sending messages to Leo to discuss the matter. Okay, the succession was settled, so obviously Louis would remain in Aachen to become familiar with the administration of the very large empire. Nope, he was sent back to Aquitaine, while Charles did nothing. It should not be a surprise that Charles chose to spend his days in a warm pool, surrounded by his large family. Charles had outlived much of his immediate family. The deaths of his daughter Rotrud, his son Pippin, his sister Gisla, his son Pippin the Hunchback, and finally his heir Charles the Younger had clearly aged him, and he never left Aachen until he died. Even Abul Abbas, Charles's massive pet elephant, had died in 810. Finally, Charles himself died in mid-January 814, aged 66. Fortunately, Charles had settled the succession several months earlier. It is important to point out that the Carolingian dynasty had risen in status in an incredibly short period of time. Charles the Hammer had been a mayor, the loyal official of the Merovingian king. His son Pippin had gained papal support for his elevation to the Frankish throne, and then Charles had become emperor. While it is tempting, it would be a mistake to say that the Carolingian Empire had succeeded the Roman Empire, even though Charles and his advisors had frequently called to restore the empire. Based in Italy, the Roman Empire had expanded around the Mediterranean, transforming the sea into a Roman lake. However, the Carolingians had expanded north and east, away from the center of the Roman Empire. Admittedly, Charles had built an impressive new capital. However, the craftsmen had been lured from Rome and Ravenna, along with much of the building materials. Basically, columns had been taken from Rome and Ravenna and transported to Aachen. Even the giant statue of Theodoric the Ostrogoth had been packed up very carefully and moved from Ravenna to Aachen. Moreover, the Frankish Empire lacked the uniform culture of the Roman Empire. The Franks were gradually introducing a shared culture across their lands as conquered people became part of a greater political entity. Still, the Frankish Empire was not finished expanding. Unlike Charles, who had initially received half of the Frankish kingdom, Louis did not have to share the empire with his brothers, so he could focus on carrying on the family tradition and expand the new empire's borders. To sum up, while the two empires had avoided a full-scale war, tensions were rising as their borders grew closer to each other. Then, 2 of Charles's 3 sons died within the space of a year, so Charles agreed to the Peace of Aachen, abandoning the Frankish claim to Venice. Since the Eastern Empire had just suffered a massive defeat a year earlier, it was eager to sign a peace treaty in order to concentrate on the Bulgars, even though it had to accept that Charles was an emperor. Meanwhile, the expanding Frankish Empire had reached the Danes, but Charles was too tired to launch a serious invasion. Anyway, Charles died 2 years after signing the Peace of Aachen, leaving Louis as the unchallenged ruler of the Frankish Empire. Since Louis did not have any internal rivals, he could focus on expanding the empire's borders. Where would Louis expand next? I will answer that question next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.